Well, we have with us again, we welcome back Dr. Grace Chung, who teaches political science at San Diego State University. She's speaking on human rights today, and I think I can say a little bit that the State Department is proposing new guidelines, parameters, definitions of human rights, and Grace will address that. This is kind of her specialty, so we're really blessed to get something that she really cares about so much and wants to share with. So we'll get started in just a second, but let's pray first. Loving Lord, we thank you for the gift of this new day, and we pray as we gather together in your name that we will listen and learn and become your people. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, take it away, Grace. I'll mute my mic and
Thank you, Peter. Thanks. Nice to see you all again. Looks familiar. It looks nice to see familiar faces. I'm heading up a new human rights initiative at San Diego State's College of Arts and Letters. So it's specific to our college, but we're hoping to work with some other colleges within the university. We launched it in 2018, which was the year of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the UN adopted in December 1948. And so it was a good, it was a good year to launch it. It was very exciting. There were many, different activities surrounding that around the world. Since especially, in the United States, a lot of universities now are establishing programs to study human rights for students. Some people have been working on it as far as research. There's numerous journals on human rights. And so, yeah, I think this past 15, 20 years, there's been more and more universities who are establishing human rights programs. So we're starting one, and we're exploring all sorts of different ideas. Right now we have a certificate for our undergraduates, so they can select from a range of courses that have human rights orientation. And we're developing a program on rights and justice at the borderlands, so specific to what's going on as far as the impact on the border communities because of border activities impact like the environment, right? Obviously the movement of people and the economy there, and so forth. And of course the culture there is very distinct because of the communities that have lived there. So we have several programs like that that are in the works. So anyway, there's lots and lots of interesting developments that we're working on at San Diego State. And I myself work on comparative perspective. So I've worked mostly in Asia, as Southeast Asia, and recently also in South Asia as well. And then more recently in Africa. So there's lots of, so I can see all of these global connections through the networks that I'm part of. One of them is based out of France, actually, and it's all of these people who've been active in this global network since like the 60s and so forth. So I've had like great opportunities to meet people who've been active all around the world in human rights issues and peace building issues. So yeah, human rights is personally really interesting to me, like academically, but also because of the people I've met through this. So like as far as, yeah, my social connections and really wonderful people. So I've always, found it interesting to compare the activities on the ground with what governments do and with how, international institutions deal with human rights, because it seems like it's like they're parallel activities, sometimes going the opposite directions, like not always going parallel in the same direction. So yeah, human rights is really, it's not linear, and it's not all one coherent thing. So looking at especially how very, very influential states, governments like the United States, right, how we deal with human rights is really important. And so when this new commission came out with the under the State Department, Secretary Pompeo had established, that really kind of interested me because it's very unusual. And I'll talk a bit about that today, but I don't know if any of you all had seen, have you all heard about the commission, the State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights? Do we have any thoughts? Did you guys have any thoughts about it when you had heard of it? I see like maybe somebody's, Donna, did you want to say something? You were nodding.
Just given the context, it can't be a good thing.
Okay.
Devoted going backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Blair Shamel. I think also it's part of what the right has been doing with stacking the Supreme Court, so that as these things go through and come up for bills in Congress to support that side of the argument, the Supreme Court's not, will not say that it is an unreasonable thing to do or an illegal thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, our Supreme Court, if we get our nominee Barrett gets, the appointment, right? There will be, 6 out of 9 will be Catholics on the Supreme Court. So it's which is, okay, but some of them explicitly bring, right, their
They
views.
will at least be very right-wing or very conservative in their approach, and not going to want to have LGBT rights or women's rights, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think this is the concern with the part of the broader trend, and you guys are, we may as well just go straight into the debate. But yeah, you're right. I'll talk a bit about that. I mean, many people are very concerned, just along the same lines as you all are. Am I sharing some PowerPoint slides?
Yes.
That coming through? Okay, good. So, I mean, I think it's also very, it's a big problem. You're right. Like there are concerns about the legality, about, how this commission is comprised. But I'll talk a bit about the backgrounds if people have not heard of it, because I saw some people seeming like, what is this Commission on Unalienable Rights? And it started out with Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State. At least his pronouncements was that, well, international human rights is in crisis. And, there are many ways to interpret that. And there are many people who have said that, right? Especially since 9/11 with the war on terror, with how, that effort to, go against counter-terrorist effort around the world has impacted human rights. And then all of the other crises, like what's happened in Syria, Libya before that, but still ongoing, all of the migrant crises that have evolved out of that. Certainly, the way the focus on human rights has kind of been lost because of those other things. I think he is, Secretary of State Pompeo is pretty good at, adopting some of the language that many international or foreign affairs observers have been using, that, human rights is kind of taken a backseat, or it's become implicated in interventionism and so forth. But what he means by the crisis is actually very different. One of the things that he had argued for setting up this commission was that, we have to really look at what we're doing in terms of international human rights, like as an international community, and, in the United States specifically. So seriously reflect on where we are, where we've been, and whether we're headed in the right direction. So whether human rights, as it is being promoted internationally, is really, doing what its purpose is supposed to be. And certainly, there's plenty of concerns, like we have the Rohingya crisis, the genocide against that ethnic minority from Myanmar, with over 1 million displaced and tens of thousands murdered, and so forth. And then we have what's going on with the internment of ethnic minority Muslims in Western China. Many of them are Uyghur, although some of them are probably others, other Turkic language speaking ethnic minorities in Xinjiang province. So there's definitely these major, major human rights issues. And why don't we address them effectively? Pompeo put together the commission July of 2019, and there was a lot of concern, just like Donna raised, like given what's going on, and Blair, as you said, what is this really about? And so there was, I'll talk about that, why there was that resistance, and they were, hoping that this commission would not be allowed to do its work, really, because they felt it was a waste of effort. It was a waste of resources. And what would the impact of its, what its findings would be, because they wouldn't just get together, write a report and do nothing with it, right? And so sure enough, though, all of those efforts failed, and they did eventually release a report this July, 1 year later. And I'll talk a bit about the contents of that, which are very interesting. I don't know about you all, but what do you all think are international human rights? What would be encompassed?
Well, shouldn't it be the things that are mentioned in the International Declaration? Mm-hmm. Which I can't remember the list, but we've been working on that for quite a while, and we supposedly even agreed to it. Mm-hmm.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which actually the U.S. helped to kind of create, with Eleanor Roosevelt led that commission that drafted the declaration. Mm-hmm. Any other?
I just want to share. May I just share that our human rights are enumerated in the amendments to our Constitution, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And I wonder if how that affected our American participation in the setting up of the Commission on Human Rights way back when. If you could speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the Bill of Rights, having been passed much earlier, right, in the 19th century, was it focuses mostly on individual liberty rights, right, like protections of our liberties. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reflected more of the thinking of the 40s with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vision of freedom from fear, from want, and so he also included he wanted to have in there ideas about protecting people's economic and social rights as well. So yeah, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration, the outcome of it was that it has, I think, about 7 out of the 30 articles address economic and social rights. So protection of the rights of workers and addressing kind of basic rights to your people's needs. So it grew from, I think, being a US-led effort to create a universal declaration. It really reflected kind of changes in, I think, our history of thinking about rights in the United States, which, started off with freedoms, like the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, of assembly, etc. So those are liberty rights, which are to be protected, but not necessarily absolute. Like none of those are absolute, right? We don't have absolute right to free speech, because if you engage in harmful speech, slanderous speech, right, that harms others, those can be restricted. And there are limits to what are considered religion as well, right? Like there are protections for religious organizations, but there are standards for what might qualify as something that is a religious is considered a religious institution. It has to have, you have to have texts, you have to have an institutional structure, just like the church does, right? The governance is clear, how you get qualified as leaders of the institution, how the institution conducts what its work is. It's not just anyone who just comes out and says, I heard voices from God. And so yeah, there are certain standards for all the liberties as well. So those have kind of been evolved over time. And then, the concern over people not being able to meet their basic survival, right? Especially after the Industrial Revolution. Well, just with the shift to industrial labor, right? You've had workers' rights movements since the 19th century who've been pushing for those kinds of rights. Yeah, so the modern human rights encompasses all of those. So not just the original American concepts of liberty rights. Anyone else had other ideas about human rights? Have you heard of? So there's a whole array of them that go beyond, but I think it's a good point to kind of what does Pompeo mean? And he does, he calls this unalienable rights because these are rights that he believes belong inherently to us, not rights that we can ask society of. So he doesn't believe that like economic and social rights are really on the same level as those liberty rights, okay? Because economic and social rights ask things of society. So they are positive rights, right? They're rights that require society to do something for you. Versus an inalienable right, you're just born with it. You're just born with your right to freedom, to think what you want, believe what you want, associate with who you want. Okay, so that would require like a negative duty, government not to stop you, or government, not to tell you what to believe, not to censor you, and so forth. So he considers those, and this is one reading, and he's not that he and the commission are not alone on, but this idea that those rights are different from economic and social rights. Okay, so he says, we have to focus on unalienable rights. And he, in the beginning of this report, which the commission wrote, they define what unalienable rights are and how they're different from positive rights. And he argues that positive rights are specific to each society. So any society can decide additional rights, rights in addition to unalienable rights, like our freedoms. So this is why the rights of states, their sovereignty is important, because they should also be able to decide their own additional sets of rights if they wish. So the most important rights that are unalienable are property rights and religious liberty, is what the report founded. And you can read it it's called exactly what this title is, on page 13 of the report, if you happen to be interested in reading it. Said that, from the foremost among unalienable rights are property rights and religious liberty. And why property rights? Why not the right to free speech? Why not the right to freedom of press or freedom of association? The commission wrote that property rights encompasses American founding principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, and the report says the protection of property rights is central to the effective exercise over other things, such as positive rights and the pursuit of happiness in family, community, and worship. So it's interesting, don't you think, that it includes worship in the report, which of course is important. I mean, this gathering is about community of worship, but it's interesting that the report, emphasizes that in its description. So they think property rights is fundamental to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and everything else. So it's the starting point of all rights. And religious liberty as well, okay, is one of the, this is the story of pilgrims, right, fleeing religious persecution in Europe, coming to the United States to practice their version of Christianity, not to be persecuted, right, by the religious authority and political authorities back in the old country. So these are the two American founding principles that the commission came up with, because they feel that US foreign affairs should be focused on American experience. So on page 20, the various parts, but beginning on page 25, the commission addresses US foreign affairs, and it also elaborates it throughout the rest of the report that the US should have its foreign policy should be rooted in American founding principles, not on international legal obligations.
It seems to
Blair?
me, knowing that, Pompeo is a very serious evangelical, and this whole idea that a society should be able to choose its own religious standards, and therefore look at what the founding principles are. And in his mind, the founding principles were Christians looking for a way to practice their version of Christianity. It seems to me like a very slippery slope towards his definition of what religion is and what is the right religion of our society. And therefore, that is what we should base our foreign policy on. And it justifies the discrimination against non-Christian sects, if you will, or types of religion. At least that's what I'm suspicious of.
Yeah,
Anyone
if you want
else?
to root it in history, that can be very concerning, going back to that. Yeah,
Right.
back to that history.
Well, the right has often talked about the fact that this is a Christian country, and in its founding principles were based on Christianity, not really, it's on religious choice in Christianity, not religious choice broadly.
Yeah. So
Which I
a bit
find
of concern.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question, please?
Yes.
I'm Gary.
Hi, Gary.
I'd like to ask a question of clergy in the audience or people more knowledgeable than I to juxtapose today's gospel reading in which Jesus allowed or separated the idea of the social requirements from the godly requirements in terms of liberty and freedoms. Would somebody be willing to speak to that? Because it seems to me germane to this discussion.
Why
Yes,
don't I
Gary.
suggest that we let Grace, I don't know if you want to take questions and breaks, or if you want people.
I don't
just
mind.
to
I don't,
open
because this
chat,
is
or-
kind of heavy, so I don't mind. We should scatter in some commentary.
Yeah. Gary, it's a good question. I think in Jesus's context, and other clergy want to, or anyone wants to jump in, but I from my point of view, the divide between religion and politics is a contemporary phenomenon that did not exist in Jesus's time. So it's very hard for us to wrap our heads around this kind of conversation because the kind of divide that we have built, I think, as a good thing, mostly in our society, between trying to build a pluralistic society that has a government that is freedom of, that does not endorse a religion, is not the society that Jesus lived in. And so they did not try to separate, to build walls in the way that we do around religion. I think part of what Blair was just saying is that some Christians in today's world also don't build those walls. And so it's a challenge to try to negotiate how to apply some of those texts in our society, given that some of us, me being one of them, don't want a theocracy. But that was really what the state of affairs was in the first century. Does anybody else want to chime in there?
Yeah, there's always a tension. Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you, Richard.
There's always a tension between trying to infuse religion in a way that's not authoritarian, and how to bring our faith to bear on political issues and so forth. I'm struck by the fact that if Pompeo was trying to establish a theocracy, kind of subtly, if you will, whether or not that's the very thing that some people came to this country, is to get away from that. But on the other hand, when they got here, say the Pilgrims, facing their hardships, etc., did the same thing. They imposed their particular brand of religion on the rest of the people, especially the indigenous people. So I don't know what that adds. Hopefully that adds some clarification to the conversation.
Anyone else would like to weigh in? Happy to.
Well, I don't know. I felt that I could be wrong, but I do thought that historically that religions and state are tied, very tied together. For example, the Emperor Solomon, who is the first Christians, and he was the emperor. And if you look at the history of the Church of England, it's very clear that that started with the Henry VI, and then passed to Queen Elizabeth. They are all in charge of the religions. I mean, that state religion is, yeah, the religion is the state and is a part of the government power. So I thought this historically has been there.
Yeah, I mean, I think
if you look at the Islamic history, some of that is similar situation, operation, very similar operation system. I could be wrong, but I'm just thought that.
Well, I think one of the things is that, yeah, he wants to rest it on founding principles, which are religious freedom. So it really should not, if that's the case, then it really should not be to assert a certain religion, and it's that particular religion's principle, or that particular version of the religion, is the case historically, right? It was a group of a Christian minority fleeing the condition of a dominant Christian sect in Europe. So I think, yeah, it's a little bit, it is a little bit contradictory to have the centrality of religious freedom, and yet, well, one of the things is that the membership of the commission is as some of you have noted, are either evangelicals or very conservative, Christian Catholic thinkers, who tend to view the religion in a certain way and its role in society in a certain way. So if religious freedom really were the central concern, the guiding principle of this commission, then their religious perspectives really should be extracted, right, from any of their preferences. And so I think that's the why some people are suspicious of this, that it really is just so kind of cloak the right-wing kind of version of Christianity. So yeah, I think, but this, in this particular case, it's to discuss the foreign policy of the United States. And yeah, obviously it was the State Department, so it deals with international affairs. Obviously, yeah, with domestic affairs, right, we're seeing on the Supreme Court a parallel kind of development. But it seems this is really to kind of say what we as Americans, what the American government should do as far as human rights in our international relations. And it argues that the Commission's report argues that it should, our foreign policy should be built on our founding principles as a country, not on international legal obligations. So it talks a lot about the American founding and what the founders intended, what the founders wanted way back, right? Several centuries back, and how that should define our foreign policy, which is to say, something about what Pompeo believes international human rights has gone wrong. And so this is a kind of a summary of a few quotes from what the Secretary has said about international human rights, that there are too many human rights being claimed internationally, and there's no serious effort to protect fundamental freedoms. And it's become more of an industry. It's really got nothing to do with anything fundamental. It's not moral whatsoever, but it's a way to make claims to say this is what we want. So he argues that this hasn't helped the case of human rights. So speaking to that point that others have made, that international human rights is in a crisis point. Okay, he's trying to answer that by saying, well, that's because there's too many different claims, too many different issues that people say are human rights violations or human rights problems. So we got to get back to the fundamentals. So this report really gets back to the fundamentals: property rights and religious freedom. Okay, those are the fundamentals to be protected in our foreign policy, because if we want to embrace all of those different rights claims, we'll never be able to function.
It's sort of like saying we have too many cases of coronavirus, so we need to stop testing.
Let's not know about
It sounds like he doesn't want to talk about these other demands. He just wants to talk about what he wants to talk about. And it sounds a lot more like propaganda.
Mhm.
It sounds like a very capital.
But I'm sorry, but I also think that even he claimed this, but in terms of action, they never really carry on either. I mean, sounds like he has this whole idea. For example, I believe the United States, either in 2019 or 2020, United States have the list of immigrants from Syria, Lebanon, right? The smallest number in whole history, only 10,000 people, immigrants was accepted. So, and those are actually was prosecuted by religions. So I don't understand. This is completely is a hypocrite. I'm sorry to use that word, but the words is like lip service. It sounds very lofty, but the action is completely contradicted.
Grace, this is Grace. This is Gary. I'm sorry, Grace. This is Gary again. If you could go back right to that slide right there. I'm noticing the CNN headline there that more rights don't mean more justice. And could you speak to the difference between justice and human rights?
Yeah, it's not that's exactly identical. I mean, there's a lot of overlap for sure, but yeah, they're not interchangeable items. And I think a lot of people speak when they say justice, they assume that it's the same thing as rights, but it really isn't. But there is a lot of overlap. So justice here could be that they're referring to what's just, what's equal, for example. So justice would be to be, being treated equally. So are you being equally protected? So it could mean that, and it could mean but it could also be not just equal treatment, but also maybe equality of outcome, like social justice. So it can mean so many things. Yeah, it's not necessarily the same thing, but he's using it kind of in a very loose way.
In
which is
our church,
precise.
in our congregation, we have a committee on peace and justice,
Mhm.
but we don't have a committee on human rights. It seems to me that our Christian faith has a mandate to address human injustice. And I agree with the idea that maybe human rights in general aren't specific to outcomes. Yeah, just outcomes.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think this is what's really interesting about studying human rights is that, yeah, it's the question of do human rights refer to, whereas like the American Bill of Rights refer to like individual rights, like what rights you have as an individual, what things can you claim. Human rights can be something more collective as well, for example, in addition. And so looking at how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights defined it, and many of the documents, many of the international legal documents, it's rooted in the concept of human dignity. So rights is something that acknowledges, right, that your life is of worth. Each life is equal in worth and as equal in dignity. So there's nobody lower. There's nobody who is expendable, doesn't deserve certain this and fundamental things.
In our country, we have millions of people incarcerated, and there is no guarantee that any of these people, millions of people, are going to receive just outcomes. On the other hand, they've been incarcerated because the majority of our country, members of our country, believe that their rights were impinged on. We aren't concerned about the rights of those incarcerated, and we're not even making sure that they're receiving justice either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's very unfortunate, right? Like our treatment of certain populations, like those who have been incarcerated, those who are here illegally, right? Like they seem to not have status as humans. Like they seem to have a lesser, like their lives are lesser worth. We just had this case on Friday, I believe. The U.S. was going to send back 150 asylum seekers from Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of Congo without reviewing their asylum applications, and they're facing likely, if not assured, death sentences by that. And so this is one of the things that's, I think, human rights encompasses, right? It's not just your rights, your individual rights. Yeah, I have freedom. I should be able to work hard and keep what I earn. I should be able to, believe what I want. But it's also to protect life itself, and protect people who are endangered, because each life has worth. And how do we ensure each life has worth? Everybody has a right to being treated that way. Okay, not be deprived of certain things just because of however our society decides. So I think this is the issue, and this is what the commission is sort of empowered to do. Okay, is address these questions raised by Pompeo, and this is in advance of the report being written. When he formed the committee or the commission, he says, he wants this commission to address what does it actually mean, okay, to say that something is a right. And so this commission gets to determine like whether something that is claimed to be a human right actually is really a human right. So it's very much, it's empowering a special commission of which he appointed himself, and we'll talk about that, who they are. There's already a bureau within the State Department that addresses the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor that already, does this kind of work, already writes reports about every country in the world and their human rights every year. So not that the US does not already do this within the State Department. And so on the international level, also kind of trying to promote this to get the international community behind it, behind this new US view. And so I think Pompeo's view is not just to kind of narrow down what US feels it's obligated to uphold internationally, but to get the international community to focus on certain what the commission argues are fundamental rights. It didn't get a lot of traction, but its idea was to say, to address the crisis, we have to be focused and just on the fundamentals. So immediately, of course, I think the reaction that some of us have had is to be a bit suspicious of this effort, because why do we need this effort if there's already, a bureau within the State Department? And who are these people that Mike Pompeo is appointing to decide what are real rights, or what he calls unalienable rights, versus what he has called ad hoc rights? Like, when you hear the word ad hoc, what do you think?
It's disrespectful of the current list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of like, oh, what? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and short term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something we need now because there's a problem now to address an issue that is temporary, right? Is conditional. It's not something enduring and unalienable. Yeah, so many groups were concerned about this. NGOs, individuals, that includes diplomats, scholars, faith, and NGOs also include faith organizations and so forth. This is to basically get rid of the other rights from the list. So there a big, major reaction to the idea of the commission, and especially that the U.S. says the idea that the U.S. should focus on the principles of the founders back in the 18th century, and just sort of forego any international obligations, because that's really not what we should do. Our values are based on our founding, and for some reason they don't recognize all the work of Americans in crafting international human rights. As we talked about earlier, right? The Roosevelts and Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, she headed the commission that wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. President Roosevelt, he insisted that the UN Charter has a mention about the protection of human rights in there, even before the declaration was written. And then, Americans have been involved throughout the post-war period in trying to create an international framework. So it's, Amnesty International was concerned that, why is this history lesson so selective? Like, why focus on the 18th century and not on, the post-war efforts that the United States has been involved with? And what is the impact of that? And it sort of, right, throws out the window all of the efforts on the international level to create programs. And there is a crisis because, our attention has been focused on security, on other issues. So human rights has not become really a steady focus. But actually, maybe it's not prominent like, the words human rights are central, but actually human rights principles are now integrated into everything. Everything that we do in the international level has to consider the human rights impact. There's, the sustainable development goals, for example, right? There's no word human rights, right, in the title or in the description, but all of its considerations have to do with human rights, right? So the goals is not just, to have more development and yield higher levels of economic good for people, but it also has to take consideration individuals as well, right? What are the impacts on individuals and different groups in society? So human rights has become, yeah, it's maybe become less like the central feature, but actually because of all the international work, it's become kind of a norm in all of the international undertakings. Okay, human rights has to be something that you consider when you talk about peace building, when you talk about peacekeeping, when you talk about environmental and so forth, and even business, like the business in human rights has actually become really, really huge. So all of this has to do with the international framework of human rights that's been developed in the post-war period. So Amnesty International is kind of concerned, why throw all that out the window and say that that's been a waste of our time? Gary?
Grace?
Yeah.
It seems to me that the United States has abdicated its leadership in the area of moral leadership in the United States with its own political hypocrisy regarding the rights, especially under the current regime. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I will. Oh, and I see I'm very little on time too, but yeah, I'll talk to that definitely in a minute, Gary, thanks. So, because of this, and as I was saying, human rights and business has actually become a big issue because we know about, a lot of the practices that businesses have engaged with that have harmed communities or workers and so forth. So there's this idea of getting rid of all the international efforts, right? It seems to be something that would be just say, oh, all of that is unnecessary. We don't need to consider human rights in our international activity unless it protects religious liberty and property rights, right? So that's a bit alarming when we think about, right, the global economy and economic practices and how, they're necessary, but, how can they be restrained to not negatively impact human rights? If we focus on property rights and religious liberty, where's room for the rest, right, that it's already been achieved? And yeah, and just, it doesn't, by not recognizing economic and social rights, by explicitly saying actually in the report that they're not really rights, okay? So that includes the right to health and healthcare. That is among the social rights of people. So in the report explicitly saying those are not rights, okay, that's something that could be very dangerous, right, globally, as we know. And then the concerns about, as we've been talking about, the religiously informed perspective of some of the members of the commission who have said some very troubling things about same-sex marriage and homosexuality and with regards to transgender people. This is the head of the commission, who is a Harvard professor of law, and she is, also echoes what Pompeo did about human rights has not been understood by many people. I think it's a little bit condescending that people don't understand what human rights is and have been manipulating it. And she has opposed numerous times in various states, in Massachusetts in 2003, against same-sex marriage, supporting a proposal to ban same-sex marriage there. 2004 said that same-sex marriages represent a bid for special preferences. So human rights should not provide special treatment, but just equal treatment. And human rights does not need to accommodate same-sex marriage because marriage is designed for child rearing, as she stated. So numerous issues that people have because many members of the commission had said things of the similar nature about reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights. So it has become kind of the instruction under Secretary Pompeo that State Department staff use the report. They must reflect the report in their work. So that is to focus on property rights and rights to religious freedom. And so, for example, the word unalienable rights has been inserted into a gender equality policy under the USAID, or Agency for International Development. And instead of talking about reproductive health, it uses the term family planning and references communication between spouses. So the assumption being that anyone needing reproductive health services is married, right? That outside of marriage, spouses, if you don't have a spouse, where are you addressed in this document? So this is something it's happened in the past too, like I believe 1996, there was an International Religious Freedom Act passed that actually the Republican Congress passed, and President Clinton signed it. And I know a lot of people who've been in the Foreign Service, and they said, yes, they were instructed to follow that document, which wasn't like this. It wasn't so encompassing, but it kind of gave special attention to people who are facing persecution for their religion, as far as asylum seekers. And it required diplomatic staff to talk about religious freedoms issues above other human rights issues. So these kinds of instructions are not unprecedented. Okay, but this one is a little more comprehensive, right? It kind of excludes the others and has particular guidelines for how to address existing policies. So yeah, this is another, there's just so many, right? So many people so many groups who have raised problems with this. And there was a lawsuit against it as well. I think Blair mentioned it. Is this legal to create a commission that is creating policy but is not representative? There is a law that all of our government bodies need to be fairly balanced with competing points of view. It's kind of removed any known human rights groups and specialists within the career State Department. So all of those, as I said, have failed. And I'll talk about what I think Gary, you mentioned, right? Some criticisms also, we don't lead by example. Some of you mentioned about, the refugee issue, right? The asylum seekers, the number of refugees pretty much shut down to like a small percentage of previous rates. And, of course, we've seen all the horrible treatment of migrants and the children who've been separated. And then our practices of defying the bureaus, actually the Bureau of Human Rights that exists in the State Department, defying their recommendations on Saudi Arabia, on the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia last year. There is a law that prohibits the sale of weapons to states that might use it to engage in egregious violations of human rights. And Saudi Arabia it's known to be using these U.S. weapons, right? And what the UN and international groups consider the greatest humanitarian crisis of the moment, are been used to just level structures that are not of military necessity for this war that is taking place and impacting civilians, obviously. And then just last week, a few days ago, lifting a visa ban on an Indonesian, the present Secretary or Minister of Defense of Indonesia, who is responsible for the atrocities committed in East Timor. I don't know if you all are familiar with that. The independence was achieved in 1999, but prior to that was a vicious, some people call it a genocide, by Indonesia, who occupied it illegally after, well, some people believe illegally after 75. And then during the movement that brought down the previous leader, or the strongman leader since 1965, Suharto, the disappearances of hundreds of democracy activists. So he's been found guilty by a military tribunal, but not in the civilian court. So now he's been readmitted, despite that he has been found to be fully responsible for a lot of the atrocities. So yeah, I think Gary, what was your question about the hypocrisy?
It seemed we can't lead from a position of righteousness with these kinds of policies if they become hypocritical, and we're seen as hypocrites in the eyes of other countries. That was my point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what would you agree with Amnesty International, its concerns about the impact on global human rights?
Are you asking me, or is that just
Or
a general
anyone? Yeah,
question?
anyone.
Okay.
Anyone want to weigh in about whether that helps to kind of address some specifics? Calvin, did you want to speak?
No, I was just turning on the camera.
Okay, all right, yeah. I don't know if that clarified. I mean, yeah, there's so much to say, but I wanted to keep it within time. But as far as what directions we're moving in the State Department with regards to human rights, any thoughts?
Yeah, my point was that we lose what we used to hold. We used to hold a position of moral leadership in the world, and the more we compromise our beliefs in human dignity and justice, we become more and more hypocritical, and we lose the respect of countries that used to look up to us for moral leadership in the world. And that seems to me one of the outcomes if we're going to do away with the way we look at our own, what are alienable and inalienable rights on the world stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that the commission was created to address a crisis, but I think potentially creating a crisis. Like there was a crisis, yes, but I think what most scholars and human rights experts meant by the crisis was that it was too much, the war on terror took all the resources and created these kinds of security vacuums. So all the resources had to go there. And that's what they meant by security crisis. So he's kind of saying, using the term crisis, but he's directing the attention and maybe creating a crisis. Moral leadership is one of them, right? Who can speak to human rights? I mean, if the US is not one of those voices, and if the US wants to narrow it down to religious liberty and property rights, and not other rights, which seems to be kind of directed at, in some cases, directed at China, right? Because of the persecution of the Uyghur minority, which is a serious, incredible case that things that they're experiencing under the detention or concentration camps there.
Yeah, not just the Uyghur, I mean, Tibetans, the whole history of Tibet and also Mongolia.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, thank you for your talk. After your talk, I feel that I have two thoughts, reflection on this whole direction or whatever the current government is. So one, I feel the action is very unquestioned. In the past, if there's the hypocrisy, at least they have to pretending to be nice. But I feel now they just put their evil doing, they justify their evil actions, the unquestioned action, but justify that. Now the second comment, I feel maybe just my bias, I feel that sometimes, well, run a country is really a lot of responsibility, and you require a lot of talents and intelligence to do that. Apparently, the current government is lacking of that intelligence and ability. So instead of just brush all the responsibility away, that make the life a little bit easier. That's how my response to that. I know maybe too linear, but I think maybe is because we all know that Trump could not listen to briefing for more than 15 minutes daily. So they have to cut the daily briefing to a week briefing to 15 minutes. So I have to see that there is a part of the lacking the incompetence of the government. So drop all the responsibility to other, but it's fine. But if the United Nations or amenities international can take a responsibility, that'll be fine. But unfortunately, United States is one of the major 5 countries in the United Nations. So still have a lot of impact on what the decision will be. But anyways, it doesn't sound so very progressive. It's like a backward. It's like we back in the regressive stage. Yeah. So it's kind of depressing to hear this subject.
Well, you know, and the State Department has been really dysfunctional throughout the administration. I mean, from the beginning under Rex Tillerson, right? It just didn't. You know, he wanted to kind of clean house, right? And a lot of people have retired or quit because of it's. You know, friends that I know who work it's an extremely demoralizing environment to work in, because there's no leadership, there's no resources, everything was on hold. They were not able to carry out their functions because they wanted to rethink a lot of, and I don't, you know, I think it's always good to rethink and be critical, but it seemed they were incapacitated for a long time. And yeah, I think the talent has a lot of people who are talented have left, who are experienced and very knowledgeable. So that's a really.
And that's why I explain why Trump nominated the new justice, who is not very sharp.
Calvin, that's you.
I was just going to say, it just sort of seems to me this rather cynical move when we have all these discussions about inequality and rising inequality and so forth, and for them to say, no, but property rights is the fundamental right. I mean, it seems like almost a cynical kind of thing. No, it's actually right for us to have these tremendous inequalities. You know, and they're not even hiding it.
Yeah, it's not even subtle anymore.
No, right.
Yeah.
Do you think that emphasize the property right have to do with, again, the capitalism, the whole idea of capitalism? Very right-wing thinking that money is everything. And how about those people who doesn't have property? Yeah.
It's interesting that, that I think that's the selective historical memory, right? Selective historical narrative to focus on the notion of as if that was really what the founders thought was one of the top 2 most important things. Yeah, I think historians would have an interesting perspective on that. Yeah.
And also when I emphasize, sorry. Yeah.
I'm thinking, I got a lot running through my head. I really appreciated your presentation. I'm going to see if I can make a coherent question out of what's in my head, but I'm really fascinated by the contrast that you presented between rights as they're presented in the Bill of Rights at the founding and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the post-war period, and the selective choice of facts as you presented last week, and these sort of competing narratives of that have emerged that are very hard to reconcile. And I'm sort of thinking about, there was a piece in the New York Times today about, you know, why one side has picked freedom as a narrative, and it seems to be the freedom that's aligned with that first set of rights. and why the other side hasn't chosen freedom as a contrasting narrative that's a more comprehensive kind of freedom that encompasses that whole freedom, that it would include, freedom for everyone being able to live in a certain kind of way. That to me is what I'm hearing is, inclusive of this sort of post-war human rights definitions. I'm wondering how if it's not only property rights but religious freedom of religious expression, how does this group of people who's chosen this identity, this definition, how do they respond when presented with human rights violations that are violations of religious freedom, religious freedoms like the Rohingya or something like that? Do they take that up and argue against it, or do they find another sort of way out of it? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen them being posed that question and address that. I mean, the questions most posed to them that they've responded, that Pompeo or members of the commission responds to, are questions of like LGBTQ rights and the rights of women's reproductive rights are the most common ones they've been asked. I haven't seen that people ask them about, like specifically, what about the Rohingya or in cases of religious minorities being persecuted? Even with regards to the Uyghur, because I think the Uyghur case is consistent with what they're arguing. They could always point that out as something they are doing with regards to China. There are lots of sanctions and other efforts with regards to the US-China policy. They haven't been addressing, I think, separately the Saudi armed, with the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. That's come up at separate forums. I think that those questions are good ones to raise, though. Yeah, and there are a few cases where they didn't respond as far as the articles that I was reading. I haven't done as comprehensive. There might have been others, but there hasn't been a lot of public inquiry also to this to this commission, and I think that's what's troubling. It seems like it goes outside of the kind of established institution that the State Department has for dealing with human rights, and it's suddenly like, I mean, this sort of reminds me, I'm sorry to say this, but like the Guardian Council of Iran, where you have this separate group of clerics, right, and non-clerics. There's clerics and other people who are aligned with kind of the radically conservative clerics, and they get to decide whether everything matches their version of Islamic principles. So this is what's the commission itself is ad hoc. It's not been, I think it's not been something that Congress has approved, right? It's not something that's gone through any of those kinds of processes that we can recognize it as representative and a part of the institution that we want to keep and legitimate. So I think it goes to show a pattern, it goes to another pattern, right, that we're seeing under this administration. But yet they have a lot of power. Nothing has stopped them from, and they go through, they say, go ahead go ahead and take us to court, because they know that will take a long time and they can appeal it and the impact as far as the security or the State Department, they have that position to speak on behalf of the country and on international levels, and they don't have to wait really, right, to say, oh, how should we handle this conversation?
So can I follow up on that? And this is maybe slightly off topic and less political science and more like civics or something, government question. But is there, this 50,000 feet, is there a way to, and pardon my ignorance, I just don't know. It seems to me like it's problematic for all of us that any administration could take such dramatic turns without the legislative branch involved? And is that is that just a function of our division, as we talked about last week? Is that in fact how our government is structured, that it's intended to be able to take dramatic turns with no checks except for court? And or is there a solution to any administration being able to come in and basically write with executive orders and commissions the rules however they like them to work?
Yeah, I think the language has some space, right? Because it assumes that we're all kind of thinking on the same page, like what constitutes the what falls under the authority of this particular office or that particular office. And I think because it's not super precise, right? I mean, laws are written so that, you know, they can adjust to the conditions, and they're written with kind of an understanding that people will read it in good faith. But if you just take the letter of the law, right? If you just take exactly what it says, you can always interpret, you can always make an argument like, oh, this is exceptional, or this doesn't fall under, you know, that. And so for example, besides the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, they dismissed the Trump administration dismissed the Inspector General, who said this is, you know, this doesn't comply with our rules. They just dismissed it. So that, the Inspector General can be appointed by, you know, the executive branch. So I guess they could remove it, but that seems to be completely in bad faith, right? Do we really need to write that in all of these things? But I think they find those little gaps and little spaces. They're quite crafty in that way, and looking at the letter of the law. Well, there's no mention here of that. And so it is within our scope of authority. This is not like the funnest topic on Sunday morning, but I mean, it's important. But yeah, I think it's kind of, because it's so obvious, right? Because it's not even subtle. I think it makes for people who are not sure, right? Like you have the people who are very committed to the administration, and then the people who've always voted Republican and are still not sure about Joe Biden, you know, like, but it makes it, at least it's not subtle, right? It's very, very clear. Some of their kind of, I think, for me, it's a lack of good faith in what, you know, what our rules are supposed to protect, as far as this being a democratic system.
We should interrupt, sorry to say, Grace, and wrap this up because some people have to go.
Yes.
Thank you so much for all of this. And
so there's my email address. If you have any questions at all, I'll put it, and Peter has it as well. Here it is in the chat if you have questions for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much again for your time and listening.
Thank you.
And nice to see you all. Nice to meet everybody. Take care.
All righty. Next week, the League of Women Voters are coming to speak with us. They're speaking about the propositions. Now, probably with this crowd, you have all voted, but it'll be interesting, I'm sure. And that'll be next week's topic. So thanks very much, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.
Thank you guys for the opportunity. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Take
Okay.
care, everybody.